Welcome, Brad, and welcome to the audience for our webinar on Prospering in a Low Emissions World, Preparing Australia for the Future. Before I start this, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands on who at least I meet, which are the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and also their future leaders. Due to technical difficulties with Facebook livestream, this event is being recorded and will be available via the Climate Change Institute website, via YouTube and Facebook pages. This means that any questions will have to be posted within Zoom. So please use the Q&A function within Zoom to do that. And you can post those from now if you want to. At the end of March, the Climate Change Authority released a report on this title, Prospering in a Low Emissions World, Preparing Australia for the Future. For various reasons, it didn't get a lot of coverage. And so here today, we do have Brad Archer, the CEO of the Climate Change Authority, to actually tell us about this very timely and forward-looking report. Brad has extensive experience working on climate change, renewable energy and energy market issues. Brad joined Treasury in 1991. He moved to Environment and Energy, where he worked, amongst other things, on climate change issues since 2011. And in 2018, he moved to the Climate Change Authority, where he's now the CEO. Over to you, Brad.
Thanks very much, Mark. Now, I did have a few slides to share, so I will, first of all, see if I can master the technology and make that happen. Just bear with me for a moment. And I think we're just about there now. All right, so thanks again very much, Mark. It's great to have the opportunity to come and talk about the authority's work. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country on which we're meeting today, which I guess in effect is all around Australia potentially, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and also acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who may be in the audience today. So I'll start with a little bit of background about the authority for those people who may not be that aware of us. So we were established in 2012, and although our functions over time have changed a little bit, our overriding purpose remains to provide independent expert advice to the government on climate change policy. So we have in effect a board, which is chaired by Dr. Wendy Craik and 6 other members at the moment, including Dr. Alan Finkel, Australia's Chief Scientist. And those members bring a really good mix of different experiences and skills and expertise across government, industry, and the like. The work that we do generally falls into sort of 3 forms or types. So we have some statutory functions. We're required by law to review the Emissions Reduction Fund legislation every 3 years. And in fact, we are have just kicked off the current review of the ERF. And we also review the legislation that implements the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Scheme. We can also receive terms of reference from the Minister responsible for climate change, currently Minister Taylor, to do a special review, and Parliament can also issue us with terms of reference for a special review as well. And then the third category is a sort of a self-initiated research function. So we can, in effect, do our own climate research and present that in a report. So in terms of prospering in a low emissions world, in effect, it's a sequel to a report that the authority did in 2016. That was the last time we sort of did a comprehensive review and analysis of Australia's climate policies with a view to looking at how we can best deliver on our 2030 emissions reductions target under the Paris Agreement. We have done a few of those other types of reports in the meantime. But back in sort of late 2018, the authority members took a decision that it would be timely to update that advice to government on a suite of policies for Australia. Again, primarily with a focus on achieving our emissions reductions targets. And that partly reflected the view that there's been quite some significant developments since 2016. Certainly there's a lot more information about exactly how the climate is changing and what globally we need to do to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. There's obviously been a lot of policy developments, both in Australia and around the world. And there's been a few other important trends, such as continuing and strong declines in technology costs, particularly in relation to renewables. So the report we've released this year sort of takes all of that into account, updates the sort of analysis and advice on the policies that we could use to achieve our targets. But I think importantly, it also goes a bit broader than that. It really sort of recognises that this all doesn't stop in 2030, which is where our current target is at. But we've got a long-term transition. We'll need greater ambition in the future past 2030. And with the rest of the world transitioning to net zero emissions over time, we need to sort of understand what that means for Australia and what the opportunities are that might be presented to us. So this little graphic quite usefully, I guess, demonstrates the inexorable trend of global warming since pre-industrial times. We have experienced about 1 degree of global warming since then, and the United Nations Environment Programme has advised that we're probably on track, given the policies that are in place around the world at the moment, for 3 degrees of warming by the end of the century. Now, of course, the Paris Agreement aim is to hold the increase in global average temperatures to well below 2 degrees relative to pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. And we know that every half degree is going to matter. So the International Panel on Climate Change has told us that by keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees rather than 2 degrees, there'll be a lower risk of extreme hot weather, flooding and drought, a smaller rise in sea level. So minimising these impacts is likely to reduce the risks of economic and social disruption. The disruption to agricultural production will be less damage to natural ecosystems, and also less risk to human health. As it happens in Australia, warming is actually happening a little bit faster. So with the data from the Bureau of Meteorology, we know that surface air temperatures in Australia have already warmed by about 1.4 degrees relative to pre-industrial times. 2019 was the warmest and driest year on record for Australia. And that was a key contributing factor to the horrible bushfire season that we've just experienced. And so the trend is that in Australia, it looks like we're always going to have a little bit more warming than what the global average is in terms of what we're seeing. And just to review our Australia's targets at the moment, this chart is a bit complicated, but it's in our report, so the full explanation is there. But the key point is that the blue line shows both historical emissions and also the government's official projections for emissions out to 2030. And then the yellow line shows the trajectory for our 2020 target under the second Kyoto Protocol period. And the green lines are our current targets under the Paris Agreement. And so we are on track to meet our 2020 target in a carbon budget sense, although in terms of a point estimate, our emissions will still be a little bit higher than the target of -5% relative to 2000 levels in 2020. But I think what really stands out is that we've got a lot more work to do to get on track to meet the 2030 target. And in fact, emissions will have to be on average about 30 million tonnes lower than what they're currently projected to be each year between 2021 and 2030 if we need to hit that 2030 target, without using sort of past overachievement or carryover from previous target periods. And the Prime Minister has said that that's the government's aim to meet and beat our 2030 target without using carryover from previous periods, which is something that the authority has recommended and supports. But clearly we also have some work to do. And if we think, there's a lot of talk about how, looking ahead beyond 2030, countries around the world are looking at net zero emissions by 2050. Certainly that's kind of what we need to do if we're going to approach the sort of the greatest ambition of the Paris Agreement, which is less than 1.5 degrees of warming. I guess if we use our imaginations and just extend that chart out a little bit to 2050, clearly the trajectories for emissions reductions are going to have to be far steeper if we're going to achieve anything like that. So turning now to the findings and recommendations in Prospering in a Low Emissions World, you know, a clear takeaway is that we're going to need much more ambitious action right around the world. That action is going to need to accelerate to get us on track for the Paris Agreement goals. And we are seeing evidence that countries are lifting their ambition. They're recognising the evidence and advice that's coming forward from the scientific bodies. We're seeing targets implementing or developing and implementing long-term strategies and net zero emissions targets. So we can think of the risks that climate change are posing for Australia in sort of two frames, I think. So the physical climate risks of the climate change that's already locked into the system. So increased temperatures, changing rainfall patterns, sea level rise, these sorts of things. But the fact that the world will be acting and acting with greater ambition over time also presents what we can refer to as transition risks. So, for example, countries taking climate change into account in their trade negotiations, investor preferences changing, customer preferences for products changing, and all sort of favouring low and zero emissions investments and products. So, as a small trading nation in a global economy, you know, those effects and impacts will be coming whether we like it or not, and we really need to be preparing for that. In fact, earlier this year, I think it was in February, the Reserve Bank Governor Philip Lowe said that the economic implications of climate change will be profound. Climate change is affecting the nature of production in Australia, the nature of investment, and ultimately the nature of our exports. So the authorities' view is that Australian leadership on both emissions reductions and resilience as part of a strong global response to climate change will be in our strategic national interest. Now, Australia accounts for about 1% of global emissions, but there are a further 176 countries around the world that account for less than that collectively account for about 33% of global emissions. So it really, you know, we really can't afford those countries with only a small share of global emissions not to be taking action. It's really important that everyone is taking action in support of the Paris Agreement. The good news, I guess, and the major theme, if you like, of Prospering in a Low Emissions World is that the global transition to a net zero emissions economy presents us with great opportunities. Now, many of those opportunities reflect our world-class combination of wind and solar resources, and these should provide us with you know, a real natural advantage in a low emissions future. So, for example, Australia has the highest solar radiation per square metre of any continent, and we've been found to have the second greatest potential for onshore wind generation after Russia, I think it is. So a global emissions future, a low emissions future, is one in which Australia can be a world leader in renewable energy production and exports. We can be a manufacturing and export base for energy intensive sustainable products. We can benefit generally from an economy powered by low cost clean energy. And a lower emissions world has the potential to open up new areas of jobs and growth in Australia, such as in sustainable agriculture, new green tech industries, environmental and financial services, and climate resilient infrastructure. And emerging technologies such as clean hydrogen have the potential to generate opportunities in other sectors as well. So if we turn to our recommendations, these are largely about ensuring that we make the most of these opportunities that are likely to come our way. So the authority found that to do that, we can probably break those recommendations down into about 3 different categories. So we need new strategies and frameworks to help us prepare and respond for these opportunities that are coming our way. We need policies that will, in effect, do more to reduce emissions, both towards achieving our 2030 target and beyond. And we can do more to empower businesses and households and communities to take action on climate change, because it's not just all about leaving everything to government, but we need the economy and society all playing a part. So I'll just quickly talk about some of the recommendations in each of these areas. So the government has said that it is committed to developing a long-term climate strategy, and that's certainly something that the authority supports and we feel is quite important. It can create a national vision for an orderly transition to a low emissions future, identify the challenges that we're facing, and assist decision makers across the country to identify the technologies, the investments, and the uses of land that are compatible with the transition to a low emissions world and net zero emissions, and hopefully avoiding the lock-in of high emissions activities. And having, I think, a bit more certainty and direction that a long-term strategy could provide will provide greater clarity for businesses, communities and households about where we expect the world to be heading and our place in it. And that can include or can be complemented by a trade and investment strategy, which more specifically looks at how we can leverage our clean energy advantage and translate that into clean energy exports, a green finance market and the like. And I think another element that's important is strategies or plans, thinking about the future from a sort of an industry and regional community perspective. So working out, where are those opportunities to transition industries from being high emitting to being lower emitting where we can, or looking for new potential economic opportunities and industries as well, and facing up to the challenges that are unavoidable in terms of managing those transitions. The second category of recommendations is around reducing emissions. Obviously, this is the key part of what we need to achieve both in Australia and globally if we're going to meet the Paris Agreement goals. And harking back to that chart I showed a little bit earlier, we do need to do more to get on track to achieve the 2030 targets, which I don't think I mentioned it, but that's a minus 26 to minus 28% reduction on 2005 emission levels. So we need flexible and scalable policies that can get us on track for 2030, but then also contribute to more ambitious targets after that. Now, a lot of the recommendations that we've put forward in this report are quite similar to the recommendations that we had in 2016. A lot of those policy opportunities still remain in terms of driving lower emissions. So that includes enhancing the current safeguard mechanism in a way that it will drive down emissions in the sort of industrial and mining sectors, with measures built in to protect our competitiveness from a trade point of view. In the transport sector, an emission standard for passenger motor vehicles can deliver emissions benefits, but also save consumers on the running costs of their vehicles and also contribute to improved health outcomes. And as the use of energy accounts for, I think, roughly 3/4 of Australia's total emissions each year, there is a strong focus on the energy sector. So that's promoting a smooth transition to a greater share of renewables. It's doing much more on energy efficiency. And it is, as we're doing those things, we can also look to electrify other sectors of the economy. And electric vehicles, I think, seem very prospective in that sense. We also have recommendations on the agricultural and land sector side of things. So we've recommended the government look at establishing something akin to the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, a land and environment investment fund, and that could invest in low emissions and climate smart agriculture and overcome some of the barriers that the sector is facing in terms of access to long dated finance. And if we do have an enhanced safeguard mechanism, that should also boost the sector in terms of creating additional private demand for land-based carbon offsets. And the third category of recommendations goes to this issue of empowering people, empowering businesses, households to take action in response to climate change, both in terms of reducing emissions, but also preparing for the climate change that's locked in and ensuring that we're prepared and more resilient for that. So in terms of the emissions side of things, we've made several recommendations about boosting support for research and development, which will be critical, not just in Australia, but globally for successfully addressing climate change. And the government has announced that we'll have a technology investment roadmap, which will stimulate R&D and the emerging deployment of clean technologies. So we're eagerly awaiting to see that. There's opportunities to add funding to ARENA and allocate funding also to low emissions agriculture and carbon farming. And there are industries out there, of course, which are, they're not waiting around. They've announced their own strategies and targets. A good example would be the Meat and Livestock Australia, which has the goal of being net zero emissions by 2030. So we think there's an opportunity for governments to get in there and help those sectors identify the solutions and pathways for achieving the targets that they've announced. And then in terms of climate resilience, all levels of government absolutely have a role to play. We think there's a leadership role for the Australian government to play in ensuring that everyone has the climate information that they need at a high quality and at sort of the disaggregated level they need to make informed decisions to prepare for a changing climate. So the authorities recommended updating the National Climate Resilience and Adaptation Strategy, which was released in 2015, and also endorsed the strategic actions identified in the National Climate Science Advisory Committee's report, which I think was released at the end of last year, called Climate Science for Australia's Future, which is all about ensuring that we are generating the science and information that will best serve us in terms of responding to climate change. And there are a couple of very significant processes the government has underway this year, which will help inform work on those sorts of recommendations. And that includes the Bushfire Royal Commission and a report that the CSIRO is working on in terms of improving climate and disaster resilience in Australia. And just a final few thoughts on sort of the major issue of the day, I guess, COVID-19. The timing of our report was such that we weren't quite able to consider the impacts of COVID-19 and how that related to our recommendations. It is something that we're looking at now within the authority. Past experience tells us that the sort of economic downturn that we're likely to experience will lead to a reasonably significant drop in global emissions. But unless governments around the world and others take action, emissions can just as readily bounce back. So certainly understandable that governments are responding urgently as they are to COVID-19, but we also can't lose sight of the longer term climate challenge. And there may well be opportunities to join up sort of economic recovery and stimulus programs as we move past COVID-19 with programs that are attempting to deliver on our climate objectives. So I guess in conclusion, the authority feels there's really no time like the present to get cracking on a lot of these ideas and a lot of these issues that will best prepare us for the changes that are coming, really, whether we like it or not. And the world is not going to wait for us to do so. So we don't want to risk being left behind and missing out on some of these opportunities. And I guess I'd just like to finish by acknowledging the work actually that's been done in the ANU on all of these issues, including in the Climate Change Institute, the Energy Change Institute, the Centre for Climate and Energy Policy in the Crawford School, where there's a lot of great work being done in all those areas. So thank you very much, Mark.
Thanks very much, Brad. So we've got plenty of time now for questions, and a few have come in over the chat function. But I'll just kick off with a couple just to start with. So you've actually started to cover this, that COVID-19 is likely to reduce both global and Australian emissions quite significantly, something in the region of about 7%. But however, as is very apparent to us, this has come at a huge economic and other pain, such as psychological pain. And this feeds into earlier narratives that say that climate change action and economic progress are at odds with each other. So how can the Climate Change Authority turn this narrative around?
Yeah, so, well, hopefully our report is a fair attempt at trying to do that and to sort of, I guess, counter the notion that somehow acting on climate change means you're compromising on, economic development or growth. Generally, a lot of the work that's been done in the past that's tried to model these sorts of issues has found that economies around the world and in Australia can continue to grow and grow quite strongly while taking strong action on climate change. The risk is, if we're not, that climate impacts eventually reach a point where we're paying a price economically anyway, and that's starting to happen. Excuse me. In the insurance industry is probably a good example there, where it's increasingly difficult for people to get access to insurance at all, or possibly just at much higher premiums in some parts of Australia. Basically, because of the way that climate is impacting on weather patterns. I mean, the positive way to frame it really is that there is a lot of economic opportunity to pursue as the world transitions to low emissions, and the authorities' view is that Australia is very well placed to do that.
Mm. Yeah, so I guess that's partly that narrative that the costs, the net costs of inaction are much greater than the net costs of action on climate change.
Yeah, look, I think that's right, and that's sort of partly been a problem of some of these modelling exercises that I've just referred to, which is that typically they haven't factored in the sort of the counterfactual of if we don't take action, what are the costs going to be? And they're also, they don't really accommodate that well, quite significant structural shifts in our economies. And so something like, for example, something that could happen could be the hydrogen industry becomes something that's really significant in Australia and presents a lot of opportunities for us in terms of jobs and growth and exports. And the modelling that's typically been done over the last 10 or so years or 15 years doesn't really accommodate those sorts of things, and so it's likely that it's understating some of the benefits that will become available. So I think it's really important to look at where the costs of inaction, and the other way to think of it is also to take a risk sort of based approach to it, which is that the risks of very significant climate impacts. The science is it's becoming clearer and clearer. I think it's already clear enough that we can't afford not to be taking strong action to address climate change.
Yeah. So thanks for that, Brad. Just a last one is that a key part of your policy toolkit is about integration. So it's about integration of climate and climate change issues with trade and investment policies, export strategies, regional development, finance, market reform, research and development, the circular economy, and so on, as well as the obvious alignment with environment policy. And all of that sounds pretty sensible to me and to a lot of other people. But what stopped that happening so far, and how can those barriers be overcome? And particularly thinking about some of the questions that have popped up in the Q&A function, which really are about how has the Climate Change Authority interacted with ministers, with the government, and how frequently does that happen? How effective is it? And can anything change there?
Yes, that's some really good questions in all of that, Mark. So I guess the starting point is, certainly I think from my point of view is that, climate change is a whole of economy, whole of society issue. There will be very significant changes that will need to be made as we transition to the necessary low emissions future, which is just that's just where we have to go to manage climate risk. And so I think there's a lot of scope to examine what those sort of linkages are right across the economy and the society. And in fact, I think the Australian Council of Learned Academies has an issues paper out right now on the energy transition, and proposing a multidisciplinary approach to developing an energy transition research plan, which will generate the information, additional science and R&D that we need to accommodate and pursue this transition, and do so in a way that's, dare I say, holistic and looks right across the economy and the various linkages that will be there. In terms of the Climate Change Authority's role, we have a role which is defined by our legislation, and I talked about the three forms of reports that we can prepare, and so we operate within the mandate that we have. We work very closely with government departments and agencies. We sit within the industry portfolio now, working very closely with DISA. We work closely with the Clean Energy Regulator. We have great contacts with other agencies such as the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and ARENA. And we're all working together on a range of these issues. So yeah, I think that's all part of it, and we're definitely looking forward to the government's long-term strategy, because we think there's a great opportunity to tie together a whole range of initiatives that are currently underway and being pursued, and sort of setting that direction for beyond 2030.
It sounds good. So just sort of picking up some questions from the Q&A. So first question I'll ask from there is from Rob Leary. So what are the practical measures that governments can invest in now that will build climate resilience through regional and rural communities?
Right, okay. Another really good question. I think if we look at our report, from our point of view, consideration of climate risk almost should be a business as usual consideration in the development of all government programs, spending decisions, infrastructure investments. And we're increasingly seeing that happen. There's a tool called Climate Compass, which some departments have started deploying within their work to ensure that climate risk lens is put across their activities. So we think that's an important starting point in terms of the role government can play, particularly where it's spending money in regions and in communities, to ensure that that spending is done in a way which is consistent with enhancing our resilience and our preparedness for a changing climate. And then the other thing we've talked about in the report is ensuring that the government is, and again, not just the federal government, but governments at all levels, are providing the best information that we can provide to these communities and to decision makers in these communities to help them make the right decisions about their spending in infrastructure, about the uses of land within their communities, again, to ensure that that's consistent with where we understand the climate to be going. And the CSIRO and Bureau of Meteorology are already doing a great work in this area, and we think there's scope to build on that even further.
Fantastic. So we've got a few questions about some of the sort of choices in terms of technology support. And one of them is about vanadium batteries. And given that this is an Australian invention, there's a lot of Australian materials, they're fully recyclable. Why isn't there more action on vanadium, more support for vanadium and similar flow batteries in Australia?
Yeah, so I must admit, personally, I've only just recently become aware of this technology. Definitely keen to understand it better and see what the potential opportunities are. There's no doubt that energy storage is likely to be a big part of the future, both at the household scale and at sort of like the electricity grid scale, and in relation to electric vehicles and all of that. And those sort of circular economy, sort of recycling type issues are extremely important, and also deserve much more prominence in terms of not just, I guess, battery technology, but renewable technologies more generally, because there's definitely scope to reduce our energy costs, reduce the amount of materials we need to use in sort of manufacturing and using renewable technologies. And then, of course, having less of a waste problem at the end of all of that. Yeah, again, I must admit, I don't know, I'm not that familiar with that particular technology, but it sounds quite exciting, and I think is pointed to a broader set of issues around this energy transition that we need to address.
Yeah. So another question, but firstly, just before we go on with questions, can people post questions on the Q&A function, not on the chat function? Because it actually makes it really hard for me to monitor, the ones that my moderator is selecting. So just put things on Q&A, same sort of functionality, not on chat if you could. So one of the questions that has just come in was, from Ian Cumming, and it said that Paris Agreement suggests that negative emissions will be required to meet all of the desirable outcomes, both nationally and internationally. And has the Climate Change Authority sort of got a position on negative emissions? Have you done any work on that? And how do you think you could feed that into the government for supportive decisions?
Yeah, look, I think we're certainly aware that the evidence is suggesting that negative emissions technologies will have to play a reasonably significant role to get us to the Paris Agreement goals. And I think we have brief mention of that in our report, and I think where we've talked about support for R&D, we absolutely think that should include negative emissions technologies. I am aware of work that's been undertaken within the Department of, well, now the Department of Industry, actually I think in conjunction with the ANU, which has sort of scoped out what the prospective technologies might be and where there might be scope for Australia to play a role in the development of those technologies, and also what the potential might be for their deployment here in Australia. So yeah, we think that's definitely an important aspect of the agenda in terms of R&D and sort of working out what can Australia add to efforts that are being undertaken around the world.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. So there's a couple of questions that have come up, which are really about effective engagement with relevant ministers, and how effective has that been, and what can be done to sort of really ramp that up.
Yeah, so when our statutory reports, they're in effect they're addressed to the minister, so the government receives our recommendations. And I am pleased to say that many of the recommendations we've made over recent years for some of our statutory reviews and other reviews have been adopted by the government, which we hope are helping improve the Emissions Reduction Fund, helping improve the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting System. And that's really our role to advise the government, and then ultimately it's up to the government to make the decisions about what policies it wants to implement and the extent to which that's consistent with the advice that we've provided or not. I guess we're always thinking about how we can make our advice more compelling and hopefully more effective. And that's always an ongoing challenge, and that's something that policy advisors are always wrestling with. But we're very open about the work we do. We attempt to publish all the work that we do. That's sort of our ethos, and we're always available to advise the government and brief the government on the issues where we've done the work.
Yeah. So just a follow up from that, which is a question coming in from the audience, which is. The reports are great, but how can you make more compelling sort of information available to the public? So you've just talked about how to do that into government, but what other mechanisms you're exploring to get that information out to the public? Because a couple of comments have come in that people didn't even know the Climate Change Authority existed. So clearly it's not working 100%.
Yeah, no, that's a fairly sobering comment, isn't it? Look, I think it's definitely something we're thinking about. Look, we haven't really been in a position for several years to invest a lot in our sort of outward engagement, if you like, with the rest of the community. But that's something we're certainly turning our minds to. We're hoping we'll have a refresh of our website fairly soon. It really hasn't changed for many years. We're hoping to get much more information out through our website over time. We did take the opportunity with the release of Prospering in a Low Emissions World to publish some fact sheets, which are hopefully a bit more digestible for a wider audience than the sort of quite technical reports we sometimes produce. Yeah, we're definitely thinking about how we can play a bit more of a role in terms of providing advice to the general community. And it sounds like we need to, and that would be appreciated. So that's also good feedback.
Yeah, excellent. So so just waiting for the next question from the moderator, but I'll just scope some down here. So do you have any sort of perspectives on regulatory approaches to reduce emissions, motor vehicle standards, energy efficiency standards, things like that?
Yeah, so I think they definitely have a role to play, and there's no reason why there's necessarily going to be one key policy measure that will, rule them all, and that's all we need to achieve where we get to help us achieve what we need to achieve in terms of reducing emissions. And absolutely, regulation is part of the toolkit that's available to government, and will often be the most effective way of achieving outcomes. And I think energy efficiency is a great example of that. We think there's opportunity to be a bit more ambitious in terms of Australia's performance on energy efficiency. And you mentioned the example of motor vehicles. Motor vehicle emission standards are fairly commonplace around the world. They have additional benefits, and so yes, why wouldn't you consider that kind of regulation? So definitely part of the toolkit.
Okay, thanks, Brad. Next one is from Jamie Manilow, which is really about, have you got any sort of information or perspectives on working with developing countries to achieve joint goals?
Yeah, so that's not a major focus of the Climate Change Authority, and doesn't quite fit that directly within our sort of functions or mandate. But we do talk in Prospering in a Low Emissions World about international engagement on climate policy, which we think is very important and has several aspects to it. I know from my previous job, Australia does work very closely with developing countries in some cases to build their capacity, including to develop their greenhouse gas inventories, which are a very fundamental aspect of having effective climate policy in a country. And the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the government do have a strategic plan around engaging with the region to help address climate change. And I think that's fairly new, actually. I think that might have come out last year. Which is a very worthwhile development. So it's definitely, I think Australia, particularly as the sort of the major developed economy in the region, definitely has a role to play in promoting and assisting countries address climate change. And I guess more broadly, there are opportunities there as well for Australia, which we talk about in the report a little bit.
Excellent. Probably just time for a couple of more questions. One of them is around about Scope 3 emissions. So a lot of companies reporting on Scope 1 and 2 and have goals in relation to that, and other institutions. But Scope 3 is pretty difficult. And yet it's actually pretty important to think about that whole supply chain perspective. Does the Climate Change Authority have particular things going on there?
Yeah, so it's not an issue that we looked at that closely with the current report. We did have a look at it when we last reviewed the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Scheme, which sort of does set out the regulatory requirements around reporting of emissions in Australia. So I guess, someone's Scope 3 emissions are someone else's Scope 1 or 2 emissions. So, the key thing is that we're accounting for them somewhere. But yeah, it certainly makes sense for a company, for example, to understand those sorts of issues, to kind of understand, I guess, in a broad sense, the effect that its operations are having from an environmental sustainability point of view. We're not, accounting for Scope 3 emissions is pretty difficult for a company to do, in terms of having access to the information and the evidence that it would need, and then how that's verified. So there's definitely some technical things that would need to be addressed if that was to be sort of required on a widespread basis. And so it wasn't something that we thought was necessarily needed to be a high priority when we looked at it a couple of years ago. But there are reasons and good reasons why people might want to understand those sort of broader impacts that companies, for example, have through their activities.
Yeah. So probably just two, one on just transitions and then one briefly on COVID-19. So the just transitions one is essentially that, what you've painted out is an opportunity for significant change in a whole range of areas, particularly in relation to rural and regional communities. But not a lot about the sort of just transitions. How do we actually do this in a way that is is not just sort of keeping people at the same level, but actually takes them ahead in those different regions.
Yeah, so I think I mean that sort of goes back to a little bit to what I mentioned in the presentation part, which is that absolutely we need to be thinking about transition for industries and communities. I guess right around Australia, but there'll be some that are more likely to be impacted than others as we transition to lower emissions. So there are sort of two broad ways we do that. One is by ensuring we make the most of the economic opportunities that are presenting themselves, so that those new jobs, those new industries can be developed and can contribute to an economy that's continuing to grow strongly. And that's obviously a great way to ensure that that we're maintaining employment and increasing employment and incomes. But it's also you really need to get down and focus almost at the individual level, because it's not going to suit everyone. There's some industries that will face harder challenges than others. But the issues are manageable, and we sort of make the point in the report that it's not it won't be the first time, won't be the last time that industries and economies have to adjust to external shocks or just simply changes in their operating environment. And we've had major changes in, for example, motor vehicle manufacturing, in steel manufacturing. We saw the closure of the Hazelwood Power Station, which was a very prominent employer in a region. And there's some reasonably good examples of the way that government policies that have come together at the federal and state level to assist people through those processes. So I don't think the challenges are insurmountable. I think with a lot of forward thinking, we can create the new opportunities that we need, but we have to be mindful that there will be challenges. There will be people who are potentially disadvantaged, and we have to work out how best to help them. And climate change impacts as they come also are probably going to affect people who are less well equipped to respond in terms of their income levels and things like that. So again, that's something we need to be mindful of.
Okay, thanks, Brad. Just one last one, just a quick one. A lot of people have asked about the connection between climate change and COVID-19. What role the climate change authorities had in terms of feeding information into the coordination committee for coronavirus, and how do we get you on that committee so that there's a climate change voice in terms of the rebuilding, reconstruction phase that's ahead of us?
Yeah, so look, we work in Canberra. We're having conversations with people around Canberra, whether they're in government departments, Department of Industry, the Treasury. We're in contact with people in the National COVID-19 Coordination Committee. First of all, ensuring that we understand, what sort of thinking is going on and what work is being done, but also looking for opportunities for how we might be able to help. We had a Climate Change Authority meeting this week, and certainly, how could you not talk about COVID-19 in terms of the context of the work that we're doing? So that's under very active consideration within the authority at the moment. We're certainly seeing around the world a lot of people looking at how we can ensure that in terms of responding to COVID-19, and we're still dealing with the the very immediate threat and risks that the COVID-19 is presenting. So I don't want to downplay the fact that it's having a major impact and major costs at the minute. But certainly, as we do hopefully soon are able to look beyond the immediate response, there could well be opportunities to ensure that when we're promoting economic recovery, promoting a more sustainable economy in the future, that we're doing so in a way that's compatible with the other things I've sort of talked about today in terms of a transition to low emissions. So there could very well be some complementarities there. And yeah, we're absolutely thinking about what advice we might be able to provide on those issues.
Thanks, Brad. So just following that thread, the Climate Change Institute has an upcoming event series on lessons from COVID-19 for climate change, and registrations will open next week for that series. But anyway, I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank you very much, Brad, for your presentation and responding to that varied set of questions that you fielded there this afternoon. Thanks again.